3 months after Robin and I first got married, I had to move abroad for a year. Before we got married, we lived together for about 6 months. To say the least, these 9 months have been sexually hot. At the time we got married, Robin was a very attractive girl with a very beautiful face, a wonderful body, long, slender legs, and small, but perfect perky breasts. We met a few weeks after she had left a failing marriage, so I was a little hesitant about my involvement. I'm almost 9 years older than her. She spent her entire life in a small town in Oklahoma and was as naive as could be when she got married. On the other hand, I was lonely and wandered around the one world for quite a long time. As naive as she was, it was a real shock to me that on our first date, we ended up on her living room floor having sex. She later said she hadn't had sex in 6 months, but even then he was a lousy asshole. It quickly became apparent that she was extremely hypersexual. I immediately realized that she belonged to me. 7 months later, we got married. 3 months after that, I had to leave for a year. Our sex life was very sweet and remained extremely active until I left. I had to realize that I had a young wife who was extremely overly sexual. I had been gone for 4 months when she came to visit me in October. During this time, we regularly sent each other tapes in addition to daily letters. When she arrived, the first thing I noticed was that her hair was very long compared to the last time I saw her. She was wearing boots and a very short dress, buttoned down the front. She stayed with us for 2 weeks when we celebrated her 25th birthday and had a great time with non-stop sex. One thing didn't change. She was completely insatiable. We continued our long-distance correspondence. However, a few months later, I began to notice something in the tapes she sent me. I wasn't tying things together at the time. Although our letters were very personal, the notes were much more revealing. A letter may say something, but the recorded voice shows how it was said and what was really meant. Even before she came to visit, I noticed that at times her voice became a little shaky, unsure, and even weak. It was obvious that at times she turned off the recorder before coming to her senses and continuing her work. But a few months after her visit, and just after Christmas, there was a subtle difference in the tone coming out of that little recorder. It was just as honest, just as full of suffering, and "I miss you." But immediately everything became noticeably different. I couldn't understand it and never mentioned it. In an almost pleading tone, I later recognized this as an admission of "I'm so sorry," which didn't sound quite the way she intended. A few months later, I returned home, and over the next few years, we had a child and became accustomed to the rigors of everyday life. I'm not saying our sex life has disappeared, but it has definitely become mundane at best. For some reason, things were different. It was as if she was holding back. Without telling her anything, I couldn't help but wonder. Then one night, I woke up to find her pleasuring herself right next to me. I was surprised and excited. I never spoke about my discovery, but after that night, I gently persuaded her to do this for me regularly. After a while, not only did she allow us to do it in our bedroom, but since our son was so small, she started doing it regularly during our car rides. On one trip, we were going on a day trip to a local resort, so she wore a bathing suit. I intentionally had our son sit in the front in a child restraint seat, and she sat directly behind him in the back seat where he couldn't see her. I glanced at her from time to time, but mostly I watched her while adjusting the rear view mirror. She was reading a magazine, and as I watched, she slowly put her hand under the right leg of her swimsuit. Over the next year or so, our sex life really improved. It was while we were lying in bed having sex that I would often start asking her about the sexual things she had done in her life. Her little stories were exciting but innocent, no big deal. For some reason, I thought there was something more there. I could just feel it. I was right. My intuition worked. Be that as it may, everything happened in a strange way. One Christmas, I had to go on an urgent business trip, which forced me to be out of town 2 weeks before Christmas. She was angry, especially since the purchases had not yet been made, and we had to hurry before I left. On the way back from the trip, I would have to drive past her parents. It was a 3.5-hour drive from our house to theirs. We agreed that when I returned, she would come there and meet me on the weekend, and then we would go home together, but in different cars. Since my trip home required an overnight stay at a motel, it took me over 24 hours to get from my place of work to her parents' house. I arrived there at noon, but found her already there. The day before she arrived very late, in complete darkness. I expected her to still be angry with me. Instead, she was incredibly horny and very willing. She drove up when it was dark and our son was sleeping in the back seat of the car. I had so much sex with her that night. The next day, as we were about to leave, she did a strange thing. We agreed that our son would go with me and she would go alone ahead of us. Although they were obsolete, we never threw away those old cassette players, and I took one with me to a business seminar but never used it. I was surprised when she asked me for a cassette player. We got home around noon on Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve and Christmas morning itself were quiet but pleasant. She kept saying she had a special gift for me, so when I didn't find it under the tree, I happily prepared myself for a very special Christmas night. How wrong I was. I had no idea what was in store for me. Right after our son went to bed, she started pacing nervously around the room. I didn't bother her, although I thought it was strange. I casually watched an old movie and watched her. Over time, it became obvious that she was onto something. Take a ride in the car. She came up behind me while I was sitting in a chair. What? It was strange. After all, it was Christmas night. Take a ride in the car. Then she walked away. She seemed to want to keep her distance from me. Her nervous gestures were very noticeable. As soon as I opened the car door, I saw this. There was a small cassette player on the driver's seat. It was impossible not to notice him. I went. Then I pressed the play button. Her hoarse, trembling voice came from the small recorder. I listened for about 2 minutes before I pulled into the dark parking lot of an abandoned shopping center that was closed for the holidays. Her quiet voice filled the car. You asked me many times about that trip to see me. First of all, I want you to know how wonderful it was. Then there was a long pause. I thought that it was all over, that there would be nothing more, although I heard the tape spinning quietly. In fact, now I think she was gaining courage. After a few seconds, her voice spoke again, softly trembling, and against the background of the distinct noise of the road. Apparently, she wrote this down on the way back from her parents. As I listened, captivated, in the quiet of the Christmas night, there were obvious pauses as the tiny recorder switched off and then on again. Every time before she turned it off, her breathing became heavy and her voice trembled. Later, after several listens, I realized that during these pauses, she satisfied herself and turned it off from time to hide her struggle. You asked so many times. I gave you so many answers. Years have passed, happy years, since then. This is what really happened. When I came to visit you abroad, I had a layover of several hours at JFK Airport. Although I was wearing a very short skirt, I took a large coat with me because it was cold where I was going. As I sat and waited, I began to relax for the first time in days. I had my boarding pass, and I knew you were on the other end. I hadn't had sex for 4 months, and I knew it would end soon. The plane was completely full. I had an aisle seat and was incredibly relieved to find that sitting next to me was a very attractive English-speaking couple from Sweden in their early 30s. He made an impression on me. I was even a little intimidated by him. They were going to stay on the plane for the rest of the flight after I got off. It was 10 o'clock in the evening when we took off, and as soon as we reached altitude, dinner was served, and then the lights were turned off. No one in my row left the light on, and I curled up under the blanket with the help of the woman sitting next to me. Shortly after I settled in, the itching returned. At first, I pleasured myself carefully and slowly. I tried not to show it with my body and breathing because the woman was leaning slightly against me, and I didn't want to make a fuss. However, excitement took over. Finally, I got up and went to the toilet. When I returned to my seat, the woman moved to my aisle seat and asked if I minded sitting in the middle as she was not feeling well. I couldn't say no. The man and woman helped me get settled, and all three of us covered ourselves with blankets. since there were still about 3 hours of flight left. After 15-20 minutes, I felt him start to lightly touch my leg. I noticed this, but did not attach any importance and continued to keep my eyes closed. The touches became more and more bold, until finally he completely placed his hand on my leg. I didn't know what to do. I was a girl from a small town who was flying alone for the first time, and on an international flight at that. I knew the only option was to call the steward and make a fuss, but the plane was full and they couldn't change me. I decided that the best solution was to pretend to be asleep. After all, he was no threat, his wife was right there, and I was soon to get off the plane and would never see him again. It seemed like the right decision at the time. My lack of reaction either encouraged him or he took it as consent because he immediately began exploring my legs. He slowly raised his hand and my hem rose with it. Everything was very slow and careful. His touch was difficult to ignore. It was becoming increasingly difficult for me to pretend to be asleep, and I think he understood that. I was slightly turned away from him, so there was no eye contact, and his soft touches continued for another 10 minutes. During this time, his wife turned a little, and her face was quite close to mine. I was horrified that it happened this way, but I was definitely excited. I think at that moment he realized that I was not going to resist. No matter how much I wanted to get out of this situation, I could not escape the pleasure he brought me. He realized that I was completely at his mercy and took control of me as if I were a schoolgirl. This went on for more than 2 hours. Not once did we make eye contact, and he never asked me to touch him. As for his wife, I now think she was part of it, if not directly involved. Throughout the entire time, her face was close to mine, and her breathing sometimes became irregular, very heavy. When the lights were turned on, all three of us cleaned ourselves up and pretended that nothing had happened. When I got off the plane, we were greeted with smiles and goodbyes from both of us. And then I met you at the airport. And the recording stopped there. Her voice fell silent. I looked at the silent player for a long time. So that's why she was so excited when I picked her up at the airport many years ago. It wasn't the erotic thoughts about me that led to such arousal. Apparently, over the years, the anxiety about what had happened had built up so much that she could no longer contain it. She was trying to confess, to communicate what she believed to be the terrible truth. However, what really became apparent was that, as taboo as it was, she responded to the illicit caresses of others and found them very erotic and enjoyable, even to this day. I listened to it 3 times before I got home. Robin was sitting on the bed waiting for me. When I entered our bedroom, her eyes met mine and didn't let go. Not a single word was said. I knew she needed to see something, not just hear it. She didn't have to worry about my reaction to her confession. She could not know that with this, she fulfilled my long-standing need. I suspected something for a long time and wanted to find out the truth. That night, she completely took over me. Her relief was noticeable both physically and emotionally. After that night, everything changed. Over the next year, I couldn't get enough of her story and asked her to tell it again and again, clarifying the details. It also gave me courage, if she gave in once. After a week or so, we began having frank, intimate conversations about her attraction to other men. I persistently tried to find out what happened while I was away, but she insisted that, despite her strong sexual activity, it was limited to just a few dances with guys in clubs. Although she readily admitted that these slow dances turned her on, but she gave me a small gift. I think she was trying to atone for her slight infidelity. Soon after, she surprised me one day with a voice tape. I listened to it in private, and it literally blew my mind. She made up a story about herself and another man. It was incredibly hot and surprised me with the vivid descriptions of her and another man in various sexual acts and how he seduced her. I showed her my appreciation, and we both started doing it. She always wrote down her stories, sitting on the floor of our bedroom behind a closed door. She always waited until our son fell asleep or left, and then she would go into the same bedroom, close the door, lie down on our bed, and listen to it. At first, I stood quietly outside the door and listened carefully to how my voice sounded. I then got creative and, anticipating what was about to happen, opened our bedroom window slightly, parted the curtains a little, and stood outside so I could hear and watch what she was doing while listening to the tape. However, there was still a certain unclear part. No matter how hard I tried to shake it off, I couldn't help but feel deep, erotic suspicions about what had happened during my absence. As I said, I noticed a dramatic change in her mood starting just a couple of months after she returned from visiting me. Maybe it was that sudden change in her behavior a few months after her return. Maybe it was just my lustful fantasy. Regardless, I definitely had my suspicions, and I couldn't shake them. Strange things happen. Sometimes 2 and 2 really do equal 4. Shortly after my return, many years ago, I learned that a young intern had appeared in the same department of the hospital where my wife worked. He came there 2 or 3 months after my wife and I separated because of my service and before her visit to me. He remained there for about a year after my return. I only met him once, and that was right after I returned. He's clearly been lucky in life. Good looks, money, excellent manners, and a fortune from the family. For a long time, I didn't pay much attention to it. I liked this man. But people are talking. They gossip. Sometimes they exaggerate to create interest. And unfortunately, these conversations reach the wrong ears. My wife has an unmarried sister, 2 years older than her, who also works in the same hospital. Unlike my wife, who is a doctor, her sister works in administration. Basically, she's a clerk. She is one of those women who cannot get her life together. For those men who find her quite attractive, her oddities seem repulsive. For those who can put up with her features, she is not beautiful enough. As a result, she never married and spends a lot of time talking about others. Personally, I have always liked her. One day, I was painting a room in her house when I heard her talking on the phone. It took some time, but I got the gist of the conversation. Apparently, she was talking to another woman who also worked at the hospital about some intern who had recently left for Pennsylvania. I connected 2 and 2 and suspected that this was the same doctor who worked with my wife. What immediately caught my attention was when my sister-in-law started calling him Dr. Husband and laughing about it. Whoever he was, it became clear that this guy had a reputation as a ladies' man and had no qualms about having affairs with married women at work. Later in the day, she started drinking, which never ended well for her. Instead of getting annoyed as usual, I decided to have a beer with her and quietly started asking questions within an hour. When I felt the moment was right, I asked about a new doctor named Dr. Husband. She laughed and readily admitted that it was just a nickname. The one she and the other women at the hospital called Dr. Husband was actually the same intern who worked on my wife's unit. In fact, his name was Dwayne. This instantly caught my attention. I continued cautiously. I didn't want to cause suspicion or concern. She proudly told me that the nickname came about because Dwayne apparently didn't want a serious relationship, so he only sought out married women to satisfy his sexual needs. The more she drank, the more willingly she talked about him. He didn't seem interested in her, and she felt rejected. "How long did this go on?" I asked, trying to sound as innocent as possible. "Since the very first month he arrived here," she chuckled slightly. "He wasted no time." Then, with her tongue loosened by alcohol, she made a small mistake. "Damn," she laughed. "I think he even tried to hit on old Robin once." She leaned towards me and smiled a crooked smile. "He had no idea who he was messing with, did he?" "No, not at all," I laughed with her. Then, after giving her a couple of seconds, I carefully continued. "When was this?" I asked with an innocent look. She thought for a minute and then shrugged. "Around Christmas, while you were on a business trip." I stopped asking questions. Even though we were friends, if she remembers this conversation, she might tell Robin that I was interested. After all, they were sisters and close friends. This thought stuck in my head. The coincidence was too obvious. While I was away, I noticed a dramatic change in her notes around Christmas. And now, years later, Robin's sister accidentally let slip that Dwayne might have been trying to seduce her at that very time. Just the thought of it made me very excited. Robin has already admitted to one random misdemeanor. Could this happen again? Did she again succumb to the caresses of another man and find pleasure in it? Or even more? It was too exciting to just leave it. Forget. I decided to carefully start talking about Dr. Husband. Very innocently, very unobtrusively, I mentioned him in one of our conversations. I tried to make it fun and casual. She tried too. I don't know if she noticed anything behind my mask, but I couldn't help but notice the tension in her voice. I smiled internally. I'd bet $100 to a donut hole that Dwayne, or Dr. Husband, was one of the men my sweet wife danced with. One of the lucky ones who turned her on, as she admitted. Oh yes, I understood all this. It was funny, and it was inexpressibly erotic. I only insisted a little after that, but it became obvious that there was a certain reaction. I decided to go further, and ruined everything. We still exchanged little erotic stories on tape every 6 weeks or so. Although it was fun and exciting, I think we were both starting to have trouble finding new stories. Well then, that would be perfect. I made up a little story about Robin and Dwayne. I couldn't wait to give her the tape. I handed it over one night when the weather was quite gloomy. As usual, I went outside and waited with anticipation, waiting to see how she would react. By the time she finally pressed play, her body was already slowly squirming under her touch. 30 seconds later, it was all over. As soon as my voice filled the room and the name Dr. Husband was heard, I immediately turned off the recorder. She sat up abruptly and looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up, put on her old robe, and put the tape back in the player before putting it in her nightstand drawer. Remaining in her robe, she immediately went to bed. I wisely decided not to bother her. I didn't say anything about it that night or the next morning, and she does too. When I got home that evening, I was finally able to check the recorder. The player was there, but the cassette itself was missing. This was the last tape we exchanged. She never wrote down the story for me again, and I took the hint. I've gone too far. Apparently, Dr. Husband was out of reach. I didn't mention him again. However, the thought of what could have been between them excited me beyond belief, and in my mind, I couldn't let it go. Well, life goes on, just like our sex life. After I received the cold shoulder for a week or so due to a failed tape, we were back to our old routine. I was still persuading, interrogating, offering. Everything to turn her on. Everything still worked. In fact, after that our sex became simply violent at some moments. Not every time, of course, only on certain days. It felt like she was sexually charged on days like this. She attacked me like she hadn't had sex in years. Of course, I didn't mind. And then, bang, a pair of scissors. I needed them to wrap a Christmas present for her. She and our son left for the night, and I couldn't find them. I searched everywhere until I gave up and called her. How stupid, but I really needed them. Her voice trembled, and I assumed she was trying to remember where the scissors might be. But later, looking back, I realized that at that moment she was making an important decision. Her voice was almost hoarse, trembling, when she finally said, "Look in my sewing drawer in our closet." The conversation ended there. I thanked her, and she hung up. Although Robin was not an experienced seamstress or a good sewer, she did have a sewing box that she kept on the top shelf of our closet. I found scissors, but with them I discovered something else. The scissors were immediately forgotten. At the very top of her sewing supplies were 3 small cassettes wrapped in a rubber band with a small folded envelope attached. Each cassette was marked with a date. The oldest was dated about 2 weeks before Christmas while I was on a business trip. Then there was another one, dated a week later. The last tape was dated December 26th of the same year we were separated. I assumed that these were just notes from those times. Souvenirs, so to speak. Memories of difficult but wonderful days. It might even have been the tapes I sent her. The envelope was a completely different matter. I looked at him. It wasn't sealed. If it had been sealed, I'm not sure I would have opened it. I'm glad I opened it. There was a note inside. It was simple and written in her handwriting. "Well, you've finally found it. I was beginning to think that I would have to send you here." Ah, that's why her voice was so worried when she pointed me to the sewing drawer. How long have these things been there? God, it could have been years. I continued reading. It only took 10 seconds. But the impact of this note will stay with me forever. You keep asking me about Dwayne and me. Your little story reveals more than just a tiny interest on your part. I'm not stupid. What you really want to know is if something happened between us while you were away. Well, be careful what you wish for. By the way, they are in order. Start with the first one. I almost couldn't breathe as I carried them to my bed. I didn't take any chances that the battery would suddenly run out. I took out an old tape recorder, inserted 4 new batteries, inserted the oldest cassette tape by date, and prayed. I didn't know what I was praying for. My loudly beating heart couldn't decide what it really wanted. I inserted the oldest cassette and pressed play. Disappointment. 15 seconds of silence. It will be a waste of time. In a way, I was glad. In a way, disappointed. I laughed. She's making fun of me. Joking. Then a voice was heard. Words. Trembling. Unsure. Hoarse at times. The breathing is so heavy that sometimes it gets in the way. Hearing her voice was a shock. If the date was correct, then 5 years had passed since this entry was made. It's amazing how her voice has changed since then. It reminded me that although I was married to an older woman, I married a young girl. I sat there for a long time. Once I pressed play, I never touched the tape recorder again, until the tape runs out. Then I put the second one. Then again the first one. Then again the second one. I waited until late in the evening before I played the third one. I'm glad I did it. This is an admission of guilt of a young wife who stumbled, made a mistake, and it's obvious that she was ashamed, but not ashamed enough to tell me about it. I knew I should never have touched those tapes. I insisted on this. I asked. She answered honestly. This was her story, her confessions. So here it is, coded and translated as accurately as I could. It's meant for you to hear. In her own words, "Hello, it's 6 o'clock on Sunday morning. I tossed and turned all night, trying to figure out how to cope with the situation that had unexpectedly arisen in my life. I wish you were here so I could explain everything in person, but if you were here, there would be nothing to explain. So I will talk to this machine, as I do many times every week, but it will never be sent. I just need something tangible to remind me of my weakness, and it's easier to explain when you talk rather than write. Last night, we had a Christmas party at Dr. Riley's house. I knew how it would be before I even went there because it was the same every time. The same people, the same overeating, the same gossip. It's cold outside, so I decided to wear a long denim skirt and a small vest that went with it, and a regular blouse. When I arrived there, nothing had changed from previous years. Same people, same thing. Dwayne showed up a little later. I told you about him, the intern I sometimes work with in the evening. Dr. Riley invited him to the party because he is from Indiana and will be spending Christmas here alone this year. What I didn't tell you is that over time we got to know each other well. Since we work so much together in the evenings, it escalated from a casual acquaintance to his strong flirting with me, and then to light, innocent touches, always from his side, not from me. He knows our situation and that I'm not interested. But he is a very nice person and really attractive. He has a twin brother at home who is already working as a dentist. Anyway, we finished the usual white elephant gift exchange and started the stupid games we always play. Last night, it was a game where you pass an orange down a chain from person to person using only your chin. It was stupid, but fun. I stood next to Dwayne and had to pass the orange to him. There's always a lot of physical contact, which I think guys like so much. I tried to give it to him, and our bodies constantly touched. It was about 10 o'clock, and the party was beginning to disperse. Dwayne gave me a lot of attention all evening. I was hoping they didn't notice, but I doubt it. Not with this company and the way they think. I left a little earlier than him and got into the car, trying to warm it up when he appeared at the window. He said he had to be at work by 12 and asked if I wanted to have coffee with him. My first reaction was to say no. It was a bad idea, no matter how innocent it seemed. But instead I asked where and followed him to Denny's. When we arrived, instead of going around the busy corner and parking in their lot, he crossed the movie theater parking lot and parked behind Denny's. It was barely lit, but I followed him. He came out and said that it was easier to park and enter from this side than to go to another street, and he was right. When we walked in, I started to worry about who might see us there. But over time, I almost forgot about it. He is very sweet, from a family with money, and is eager to return home. He was used to sharing everything with his twin brother. While we were drinking coffee, the conversation started to get very personal, and he asked a lot of questions about us. Without thinking twice, he switched to my sex life in your absence, or lack thereof. I told him I was coping, and I could get through this. He didn't insist, but his interest in me was obvious. It was almost like school flirting, except we weren't at school. It was already well after 11 when we left. I walked to my car and was ready to leave when he knocked on the passenger side window and got into the car. He said, "I forgot to show you something," and pulled out a stupid sprig of mistletoe. He extended his hand, held it above my head, and quickly kissed me on the lips. I felt it all over my body, right down to my fingertips. I just laughed and said, "Thank you." My mistake was letting him linger. What I should have done was pull away. Instead, I'm sure he took my pause as approval and kissed me again. I expected another small peck, but was caught off guard when it was a full, warm kiss. It was wrong, I knew, but it felt so damn good. It had been so long since I felt someone's lips on me. I simply gave in to his kisses, as if reluctantly, but willingly. Any thoughts about possible danger passed me by. His kisses became like fire to me, and I felt my body responding to them. And then we had sex. It's 5 in the morning, and I've had time to think about it all. And yet, despite how bad I feel, the pleasure of what happened washes over me again. You know that I love you and would never do anything to hurt you or damage our relationship, but there is a fire burning inside of me that I find difficult to deal with. But I can handle it, and this will never happen again. I'll keep this tape. She will remind me of my needs, my weaknesses, and that I need to be more careful not to get into a situation that could get out of control. It's my fault, not his, and I accept that. You'll never hear this, but please forgive me. I love you. Then she turned off the recording. The little tape recorder went silent. I looked at him for about 2 minutes. I should have felt the pain, anger, disgust, something. Instead, the only word that could describe me in that moment was insatiable. I was shaking all over, eager to hear more. And there was more. I changed the cassette. I was shaking so much I could barely get the next one in. Softly, her voice filled the room again. "Hello, it's me again, whoever I am now. I never thought I'd find myself here again, when another letter was just an apology for a single, isolated mistake. But here I am lying in our bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, unable to sleep, replaying in my head what happened just recently. The same deep shame I felt last week comes over me again. After what happened in the car last week, I've tried my best to avoid any personal contact with Dwayne, but it's hard when we work the same shifts. I was ashamed, and I didn't know how to deal with it. I couldn't just openly blame him for what happened, but I also couldn't act like he wasn't part of the problem. I decided that we were two adults, responsible people who could handle the situation, and I swore it was over. I really wanted to just forget about the whole thing and let it all fade away without any major showdowns. I was relieved when he didn't push, acting friendly, professional, and casual, just like he had been before all this happened. After a couple of days like this, I felt comfortable again. Christmas was just a few days away, and I didn't want it to be overshadowed by any of this. It will be difficult anyway, since you are not around. Last night, I worked the evening shift. As usual on Sundays, it was quiet. There was only an hour left before my shift ended when Dwayne came in to look at some x-rays. Nothing critical, just a broken arm, which was admitted to the emergency room a little earlier. I showed him the pictures, and he was standing right behind me. We were the only ones in the department, as there is only one person working here on Sunday nights. While we stood, I felt him move closer to me. His body was in contact with mine along the entire back and at the level of the legs. Then, very softly and quietly, he brushed my hair away from the back of my head, and I felt his breath on my neck, and then a light kiss. I walked away. No, Dwayne, I don't want that. I didn't want to believe that I was in this situation again. I pushed his hand away and left, saying that my shift was almost over and I needed to finish my work. I didn't want to make a scene, so I went to the back of the department where the film processing room is and went in there to hide from him. I felt safe in the soft red light of the dark room, making it my refuge from his advances. I planned to give him a few minutes to leave. Instead, after a few seconds, the door opened and he walked in with me. He pressed a switch that turned on the outside lights, warning people that the room was in use and not to enter. We were essentially isolated with no chance of being seen or heard until we got out. There was no choice but to fight it, so I decided to deal with it directly. I knew that my body was already starting to warm up from his presence, and I needed to get out of here immediately. What do you want, Dwayne? You know that I'm married and I can't do anything with you. I didn't know what answer I was expecting, but it certainly wasn't the one I received. I tried to move away from his kisses, but they found my mouth. And we had sex again. He left the room, looked back, and gave me a sign that the coast was clear before leaving. I started crying, getting myself in order. I was just someone. I wasn't seduced. They didn't love me. No, instead I just somehow gave in to this craving inside of me. And yet, hours later, I'm still shaking with excitement from it all. God, how good it was. I knew deep down that if I tried a little harder to avoid this, I could. But apparently, deep down, I really didn't want him to stop. Goodbye. I looked at the little tape as if it were a movie. Her words and my imagination painted a picture so vivid that it could have been a video. Perhaps, in some ways, the image I conjured up could have been much more graphic, more sexual, more graphic than what actually happened that night 5 years ago. It was hard enough just to move. There was another cassette nearby, beckoning me. I couldn't handle it. Not at this moment. I still needed to wrap a few gifts. I wasn't about to become a hostage to this little spinning machine. Yes, I was going to. Just a few hours later, this little device was lying next to me on the couch. I pressed the button. She spun. Pause. Then, her voice. Third cassette. Date, December 26th. I'm here again. It's 4 o'clock in the morning. Christmas has come and gone. I was glad to hear your voice before Christmas, but now it seems so long ago. I probably did the right thing by working a 24-hour shift on Christmas night to make the day go by faster. This didn't stop me from realizing that Christmas has come and you and I are not together. I was surrounded by other people who were doing the same thing. Almost all non-family staff worked extended shifts to try to cover for those with children. By the end of the day, we were a tired group ready to head home to our circumstances. Some were heading to late family gatherings, but I wanted nothing to do with it, and our family activities were long over, thank God. All I wanted was to shower, eat, and sit in front of the fireplace. It was very cold outside, and I needed to get rid of the depression caused by not having you around. I did so and found myself sitting in front of the fireplace with wet hair and a long flannel nightie. It was probably a mistake to slow down because I started to feel time to start thinking again. It wasn't just the feeling of missing you, but all the other things that had recently come into my life. Despite my regrets about my 2 encounters with Dwayne, every time I think about being with him, I get extremely horny. I think he knows he has this effect on me. I can tell by the expression on his face and the sparkle in his eyes, as if he is saying, I know your sexual weaknesses and can take advantage of them at any time. Twice last week, while we were working the same shift, he came into the department and started touching me while he was looking at the X-rays. It was basically a neck massage, and then his hand would slide down to touch my breasts through the fabric. I don't know what excited me more, his touch or the confidence with which he did it. Although I protested and pushed his hands away, he must have felt that I belonged to him. All this lasted about 30 minutes, when suddenly there was a quiet knock on the door. I jumped up straight, frightened by this intrusion. It had to be one of my sisters. When I opened the door, I was stunned to see Dwayne there. I didn't even know that he knew where I lived. I never gave him my address or phone number. I think I looked awkward just standing there. Finally, he said, "Hi, can I come in?" How stupid I must have looked. It was well below zero outside. I answered, "Of course," and stepped aside. A big time bomb was starting to tick inside me. I could feel it. I had no right to let him into the house. I told him I didn't know he knew where I lived. He replied that he followed me home one night. He then said that his apartment was too lonely and he decided to take a chance and come, hoping that no one would bother me. I wasn't sure what he meant by, "no one will bother." I had already told him earlier in the evening that I was coming home to an empty house. I said that this was normal, but nervous trembling was already starting to shake inside me. It just wasn't the right time to be alone with him in front of the fireplace. But I took his coat and offered him a cup of tea. He sat right in front of the fireplace and drank tea while I sat on the sofa, innocently opposite him. Over time, I calmed down a bit as we just had a casual conversation about past Christmases we had experienced. Dwayne came from a family with money, so he went through a lot more than I did. He traveled abroad a lot and did other things like that. After a while, he stood up to put his cup away. I offered to do this, but he refused. When he returned, he sat on the opposite end of the sofa from me. I added some more wood to the fire while it was busy, but the flames stayed very low and nice. I felt rather ridiculous in my flannel nightie and with my hair wet, but he didn't notice, knowing that I had just taken a shower. Instead, he invited me to put my feet on his lap. I didn't hesitate because my legs were tired after a long shift. He gently began to massage them while we talked. I knew it was getting too intimate, but it felt so good that I didn't want him to stop. After a very long, sensual foot massage, there should have been no surprise when his hands slowly began to move up my legs. Oh, he was in no hurry. There was no reason to worry. It must have been about 15 minutes before they reached my knees. But they didn't stop there. It was then, in the midst of all this, that it suddenly burst out. "I love you." I immediately regretted it. We both knew it wasn't true. I think we both understood what I really wanted to say. I meant that I like being with him at the moment. I like what he does to me. After that, I realized that although neither of us wants something permanent, it won't end anytime soon. He knows that he has the upper hand over me, and that I am ready to do anything to satisfy my body. Like now, just thinking about him. Goodbye for now. That's it. From the moment she came home the next day, I probably listened to all 3 recordings at least 10 times. When she returned home, we both acted as casually as possible. That night, we devoured each other, and it continued until Christmas. We never mentioned the cassettes. I knew that at some point we would have to discuss this. But how? I am married to an extremely intelligent woman, and extremely erotic. She saved one gift under the tree. When she gave it to me, she told me to open it when I was alone. Needless to say, I was left alone as soon as possible. When I opened the small package, there were scissors and a note. "I see that you found the scissors." Apparently, she looked into the thread box to see if I had found the hidden treasure. "Did you like it? You wanted them so bad." I didn't answer her note. Not right away, at least. Instead, later that evening, after we had put our son to bed, she announced that she was going to take a shower. The day was stressful, to say the least. Fortunately, we had many guests. I waited for her to come out of the shower. She was hesitant when I approached her. "I really liked the scissors," I whispered as my lips met hers. I led her to the bed. I wanted to express my endless gratitude. "Just a minute," she said, pushing me away. She went to the closet and started rummaging through it. When she came out, it took me a few seconds to realize what was happening. She was wearing an old red flannel nightie. Somehow I knew it was the same one she wore on that erotic Christmas night 5 years ago. Her eyes didn't leave mine. When I didn't speak for a few seconds, I think she thought she had misunderstood me, that I didn't find her cheating exciting. In fact, it was difficult for me to speak. I squeezed out one word. Stop. I raised my hand. What's my name? I quietly asked the question. Will she understand? She understood. A few seconds passed before she responded with a hoarse moan. Dr. Husband. It's going to be a fantastic Christmas night. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next